$1.4 million. That is the number currently sitting like a loaded gun on the Indiana Fever's front office conference table. Not because it represents a straightforward player acquisition, because it represents the single most dangerous financial trap in the history of the WNBA's new economic landscape. And if the Fever's front office misreads it, Caitlin Clark burns through her prime years on a roster that was never actually built to compete. Right now, Kelsey Mitchell is an unrestricted free agent demanding exactly that figure, the full supermax contract under the newly restructured collective bargaining agreement. The casual sports media narrative treats this as a formality. A fan favorite deserves to be paid. An emotional cornerstone of the Fever's rebuilding years should be rewarded. The front office writes the check, the internet celebrates, and the basketball world moves on to the next storyline. But that framing is dangerously wrong, and many of you watching have already sensed it. You have already run the math in your head. You have noticed the structural problem sitting underneath the emotional narrative. Because you are not here to consume manufactured sports media spin, you are here to understand what is actually happening inside the Indiana Fever's boardroom right now. If this kind of financial forensics is exactly what you have been looking for, hit that like button right now. Because what we are about to break down is going to fundamentally change how you watch this Fever offseason. Let's establish the full picture. The 2025 collective bargaining agreement represented the most significant financial restructuring in the WNBA's entire history. The team's salary cap expanded to $7 million, a number that finally created the conditions for genuine roster depth across the league. For the first time, front offices had real flexibility, real room to build rotations with multiple high-quality contributors instead of one expensive anchor surrounded by minimum salary fillers. Real room to surround a franchise cornerstone like Caitlin Clark with the kind of diverse, high-efficiency personnel that championship rosters are actually made of. But the CBA's financial expansion created a corresponding expansion of financial risk. When you can legally offer a player $1.4 million, the institutional pressure to do exactly that, especially for a popular veteran on a rising team, becomes a gravitational force that is enormously difficult to resist. That pressure is pointing directly at Kelsey Mitchell right now. Here is the number that should anchor every single conversation about this decision. $1.4 million represents 20% of Indiana's total available salary cap. One player, 1/5 of the entire roster budget. And the player in question is not a franchise cornerstone. She is a talented secondary piece whose fundamental playing style creates direct structural friction with the offensive infrastructure that Caitlin Clark requires to operate at her actual ceiling. This is the part of the Mitchell analysis that the mainstream basketball media is completely unwilling to say out loud. Mitchell averaged 20 points per game in Indianapolis. That number reads impressively on a statistics sheet. But the mechanism behind those 20 points is the critical variable the supermax conversation is actively ignoring. Mitchell's offensive game is built on isolation. She holds the ball, creates off individual matchups, and works through defenders one-on-one to generate her scoring opportunities. In a traditional WNBA offensive system, that skill set carries legitimate standalone value. The Indiana Fever under Caitlin Clark are not running a traditional WNBA offense. They are operating the most dangerous transition system in women's basketball. Clark's generational value, the specific multiplier that makes her a franchise centerpiece rather than merely a very good point guard, comes from her ability to function as the central quarterback of a movement-based, fast break-oriented machine. She reads the full floor in real time. She delivers full-court transition passes that no other point guard in the league can execute. Her threat as a pull-up shooter and long-range scorer forces defensive rotations that create driving lanes for every single player around her. Every possession that stalls for an isolation sequence breaks the rhythm of that system. Every time the ball settles in Mitchell's hands for an extended single coverage play, the spacing Clark depends on collapses, and the transition opportunities Clark generates become impossible to convert. Isolation basketball and transition basketball are fundamentally incompatible offensive philosophies, and the Fever are being asked to spend 20% of their cap to commit to the one that directly undermines their primary weapon. Now we arrive at the opportunity cost calculation that makes this situation genuinely alarming. $1.4 million, the exact price of Kelsey Mitchell's supermax demand, is not one player's salary in the current WNBA market. It is three. At the valuations shaped by the new CBA, elite role players with genuine two-way profiles are accessible in the $500,000 to $600,000 range. Quality athletic contributors with specific tactical identities that complement transition offenses are available in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. The mathematics of the modern WNBA economy make a 3-for-1 arbitrage strategy not just theoretically elegant, they make it practically executable right now in this specific free agency cycle. Bridget Carleton is the name that should be lighting up every analytical dashboard inside the Fever's front office. A highly versatile, intelligent two-way guard with elite physical size for her position. She spent last season operating on a contract worth exactly $125,000, a staggering market undervaluation relative to her actual production and tactical profile. The correction the open market will apply to Carleton this summer is substantial. Realistic contract projections land her in the $500,000 to $600,000 range. She is a movement-oriented, system-compatible player whose offensive profile is built around catch-and-shoot efficiency and the kind of floor spacing that the Fever's transition system specifically rewards. She does not need to create her own shot. She needs to be in the right place when Clark is reading the floor. And she has demonstrated exactly that capability. The second component of this blueprint centers on Burrell, a wing player who spent last season in a deeply dysfunctional Los Angeles Sparks situation that suppressed her statistical output by surrounding her with inadequate playmaking infrastructure. Burrell's defining physical asset is raw athletic speed, an elite characteristic in isolation, but an entirely different category of weapon when paired with a point guard who can actually deliver the ball to her in transition. In Los Angeles, Burrell never had that quarterback. She possessed the speed without the system capable of activating it. In Indianapolis, she would have the greatest transition passer in the league's history. Her value on the Fever's roster is not who she was in LA. It is who she becomes when Clark is releasing full-court passes and she is the fastest player on the floor, sprinting to meet them. These two players, Carleton and Burrell, represent approximately $1 million in combined salary at current market projections. Two distinct tactical profiles, two specific roster holes addressed. The Fever still have budget remaining. The third element of this strategy solves the front-court depth problem that the expanded 52-game schedule has made genuinely non-negotiable for any legitimate championship contender. This is not the old 36-game format that teams could survive on 6 rotation players and a favorable injury schedule. The expanded season will physically expose rosters without genuine interior depth during the second half of the year. Exactly the stretch when playoff seeding is being decided and fatigue risk peaks. Temi Fagbenle is the proven veteran solution. Fagbenle carries direct, first-hand experience operating within the Fever's specific offensive tempo. She understands the spacing requirements, the pace of play, the precise way Clark reads the floor during transition sequences. She arrives as an institutional knowledge asset, not just a physical presence. Her ability to finish interior sequences generated by Clark's drive and kick game adds a layer of rim pressure that forces opposing defenses to compress, which creates the exact perimeter spacing that Carleton and Burrell need to operate. For organizations willing to gamble on developmental upside, whereas Leticia Amahira represents a younger alternative, a raw but athletically gifted forward whose ceiling within Clark's system is difficult to project precisely because she has never operated alongside a playmaker of Clark's caliber. The risk is real. The upside of a physically mobile young forward discovering her offensive game beside the league's premier transition quarterback is the kind of calculated investment elite front offices make when the price point justifies it. Either option is executable within the remaining budget after committing to Carleton and Burrell. 3 players, 3 distinct positions addressed, 3 different tactical profiles that collectively fill every roster void that Mitchell's departure creates. For the exact financial commitment as one isolation scorer whose game actively conflicts with the system. The Indiana Fever front office is staring at a decision that defines their organizational identity for the next half-decade. And understanding exactly what this decision means for the Eastern Conference race and for Caitlin Clark's actual championship timeline requires going one level deeper into what the Fever stand to lose if they get this wrong. Now let's talk about the players the Fever actually get to keep if they execute this strategy correctly, because this is where the decision becomes about more than just the new names coming through the door. Before we go there, drop your prediction in the comments right now. Does the Indiana Fever front office have the analytical courage to let Kelsey Mitchell walk? Or do they cave to fan pressure and write the supermax check? Because that question is going to determine whether Indianapolis is a genuine championship contender over the next 3 or 4 years, or a television product built around a star who never actually gets the infrastructure she needs to win. The retention mathematics on Lexie Hull and Sophie Cunningham are directly tied to the Mitchell contract decision, and the mainstream basketball conversation is almost completely skipping this connection. Hull is one of the most underappreciated defensive assets in the entire league. She is a disciplined, high-motor perimeter defender who disrupts opposing primary ball handlers through relentless off-ball activity and generates transition opportunities that directly feed Clark's strengths. Her presence on the floor gives the Fever a functional defensive identity without requiring her to carry any offensive responsibility. But quality contributors with that profile do not accept minimum contracts indefinitely. Hull has legitimate market leverage in the current environment, and if the Fever have exhausted their cap flexibility on the Mitchell Supermax, they are negotiating with her from a position of structural weakness. They either underpay her in a way she eventually rejects, or they lose her to a better-positioned franchise that was smart enough to preserve the room. Sophie Cunningham's situation carries additional organizational weight because of what she represents to the specific culture this roster has built. Cunningham is the Fever's physical enforcer, the veteran whose presence on the floor communicates to opposing players that there are real consequences for taking liberties with Caitlin Clark. The WNBA's competitive landscape has made it abundantly clear that Clark draws physical attention from opponents specifically because her value is so transparent. Managing that dynamic requires a player who brings accountability to the floor without needing to be asked. Cunningham is also a legitimate three-point threat who provides floor spacing without demanding ball-dominant possessions, exactly the kind of low-maintenance, high-value contributor that championship rotations depend on. Losing her for cap reasons while simultaneously paying an isolation scorer to disrupt the offense is organizational self-sabotage dressed up as loyalty. The combined value of retaining Hull and Cunningham extends beyond their individual statistical contributions. These two players represent the defensive and cultural backbone of a team with a genuine identity. Championship rosters are not assembled entirely from metrics. They are assembled from players who understand their specific roles and execute them without ego. That kind of culture takes time to build. The Fever have it right now, and it is only financially sustainable if the Supermax line item stays empty. Real quick, if this kind of deep roster forensics is exactly the reason you keep coming back to this channel, hit that join button below. Your support is what makes it possible for us to keep going this deep into the numbers that most other channels simply do not have the patience to run. Now let's zoom out to the competitive landscape, because the external environment makes this decision even more time-sensitive than the internal roster math alone suggests. Portland and Toronto are entering 2026 free agency as expansion franchises with clean cap sheets and ownership groups that are aggressively motivated to generate immediate credibility with brand-new fan bases. Expansion teams operating in that specific context are historically willing to significantly overpay for name-brand veterans. They do not necessarily need Mitchell to be efficiently priced relative to her production. They need her to be a recognizable name that validates their competitive identity in year one of operation. That market dynamic is not a threat to the Fever. It is an arbitrage opportunity. If Portland or Toronto enters the bidding at the full supermax figure, Indiana exits the negotiation cleanly. No counteroffer required, no difficult public explanation needed. The market absorbed a player whose contract did not fit the Fever's system, and Indianapolis walks away with full cap flexibility and a front office that made a dispassionate, process-driven decision. The Eastern Conference competitive picture intensifies the urgency further. New York and Connecticut have reached the conference's upper tier through precisely the kind of movement-oriented, depth-driven roster construction that the 3-for-1 blueprint delivers. The Liberty are not a franchise that gets beaten through individual isolation production. They get beaten through superior systemic pace, through a lineup configuration that forces their defense into rotational decisions it cannot execute at speed across 4 quarters of playoff basketball. 5 mobile, spacing-oriented players around Caitlin Clark creates that problem. 4 movement players around 1 expensive isolation scorer does not. The margin in an Eastern Conference playoff series is thin enough that the roster construction difference matters enormously. If this analysis is landing differently than what you have been hearing from the mainstream basketball media, share this video right now. The conversation around Kelsey Mitchell is operating almost entirely backwards, and the people in your timeline deserve to see the real financial picture. Now let's address the uncomfortable reality that sits underneath all of the roster analysis, the one that transforms this from a basketball decision into something with genuine long-term consequences. Caitlin Clark is 22 years old. She is operating in the early stage of what could become a 15 or 20-year professional career. But the window for competing at the absolute peak of her athletic capabilities, surrounded by a deliberately constructed championship infrastructure, is not that long. That specific window, the overlap of Clark's explosive athleticism, the Fever's organizational momentum, and the new CBA's financial flexibility, exists right now. Front offices that misallocate resources during windows like this do not typically receive clean second chances. Organizational momentum compounds or dissipates. It rarely resets. The NBA's history provides instructive case studies. Franchise after franchise, teams built around genuinely elite cornerstone players undermined their own championship windows by committing excessive cap resources to secondary pieces whose contracts created structural financial rigidity at exactly the wrong moment. The player in question was usually popular. The decision was usually emotionally logical in the short term. The consequences usually took 2 or 3 seasons to fully materialize, by which point the star player's prime years had already been partially consumed. The WNBA's new economic structure makes those same mistakes newly possible in women's basketball for the first time. The supermax is real. The opportunity cost is real. And the emotional pressure on the Fever's front office to avoid making what looks like a cold, unpopular business decision is more intense right now than it has ever been for this franchise. Aaliyah Boston adds another dimension to this calculation that deserves direct attention. Boston has established herself as one of the most skilled interior forwards in the league, a player with genuine post-game, intelligent off-ball movement, and the competitive instincts of a legitimate co-star. Her development alongside Clark is not a finished product. It is an ongoing process that depends heavily on the quality of floor spacing and movement surrounding her. Boston's post-game flourishes when the perimeter is alive with credible shooters and cutters who demand defensive attention. Bridget Carleton's spacing instincts serve Boston's interior leverage more directly than Mitchell's isolation habits ever could. The Fever's championship ceiling is not just about Clark. It is about what Clark and Boston can become together when surrounded by the right pieces. Some of you have been saying this for weeks, that this front office is capable of making the analytically correct call even when the internet demands the emotionally comfortable one. The 3-for-1 arbitrage is the decision that proves whether that belief is warranted. And the analytical community is watching closely. The Indiana Fever have never had a decision quite like this one sitting on their table. The new CBA created financial leverage that women's basketball franchises have simply never possessed before. The presence of Caitlin Clark transformed every single roster decision into something simultaneously more important and more emotionally complicated than anything this organization has previously navigated. The franchises that win in this new economic era are the ones willing to make the cold, mathematically correct call. The ones that understand that roster construction is a financial discipline first and a public relations exercise never. Executing the 3-for-1 blueprint is not a betrayal of Kelsey Mitchell. It is a recognition that the Fever have a generational competitive window open right now, and that window demands a specific kind of roster that her contract does not allow them to build. The front office decision is coming. When it lands, this channel will be the first place breaking down exactly what it means for Clark's offensive ceiling, for Boston's developmental trajectory, for the full Eastern Conference landscape, and for what the Indiana Fever are actually capable of building over the next 4 or 5 years. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on notifications, because the moment that call drops, you want the real analysis immediately, not 12 hours later, from someone who spent those 12 hours figuring out which direction the narrative wind was blowing. And drop your prediction in the comments one more time. Does Indiana execute the arbitrage and let Mitchell walk, or does the emotional pressure win? I will see you in the next breakdown.